Right, good evening, everybody. You could find your seats. So obviously, it's with a bit of sadness that this is our last of our 4 talks with Jake, who's been with us this summer. It's been a blast to have him here. Jake's, for any of you who haven't seen, who weren't here for the previous talks, they're all, they're recorded now. You can find them on Prince Pieces, the places where we have videos like YouTube, etc. So please do check those out if you missed this previous talks. But it's been awesome having Jake here with us. I'm excited to get one more chance so we can pick his brains. So bring your hard questions. He can take it. Sorry, Jake. I'll go ahead and welcome Jake up with you one more time. Thanks, Jake.
Okay, thank you guys for coming. Once again, obviously this is my last time being here. It's been a pleasure to give these talks with you guys. So this talk is different from the other 3. Of course, it's philosophy of science, and that this class I struggled a little bit with. The other classes I did pretty well in, but this one, because I'm not a mathematician or scientist myself, but I found it really intriguing, really relevant to today, and just kind of how the church relates to the world and everything like that, I'm very excited to talk about this. We live in a world today where, as Bill Nye the Science Guy said, science rules. Sounds a powerful thing. No one can really ignore it. We have all this technology. All of it's being talked about all the time. And, you have examples such as the Copernican revolution, where people started realizing that maybe the Earth rotated around the sun rather than the other way around. And people like us had to change our worldview because before they thought it was a biblical truth, that the sun revolved around the Earth and that the heavens was where God was and where all the angels were. And so science can have that kind of effect. It's something that we can't ignore, and we have to understand science, especially in respect with what we believe. Now, so a lot of the questions that this course studied were just things like, what is science? What makes something a genuine versus a non-genuine science? And what are we to make of science? So with that, I get into the content of this course, which I took at Catholic University, my seminary. So the first major author we read in this class, his name was Carl Hempel, and he wrote up this book called The Philosophy of Natural Science. So that just kind of gets into a lot of these questions like we were talking about. So science, of course, has mostly become a big thing since the Enlightenment, the 1600s, the 1700s. People started documenting it, BC, but there was sort of this dark age, people might say, of science for centuries. But now, so Carl Hempel published this book in 1966, and he talks about the scientific method, the things that were typically taught in our science classes, while making some qualifications, talking about what science is really like. And one of the things he talks about is, of course, in the process, we're told you make a hypothesis, you collect data, you do experiments, you make conclusions and everything like that. And it's really never as simple as it might be made to seem as that works. For example, he talks about data really involves collecting all of the relevant data. You can't collect all the data that's out there. It's impossible. And also, he says, contrary to what you might think, no hypotheses can ever be fully proven true or false, he says. He says in the book, no statement or set of statements can be significant. Now he's talking about here is about what makes a genuine science. No statement or set of statements can be significantly proposed as a scientific hypothesis or theory unless it is amendable to objective empirical tests, at least in principle. So he's saying for it to be science, you have to be able to test it, at least in principle. And in principle, he means there are things such as, the gravity on Pluto that we couldn't test right now, right away, but in theory you could be able to do it. And he says this is what distinguishes science from non-science. This is what distinguishes a true hypothesis from what he calls a pseudo-hypothesis. Now, for example, he talks about this ancient theory that said the reason the planets move around the way they do is because there's sort of this mutual attraction between planets, kind of like love. So it draws the planets towards each other. Now, he says, you can't test this theory in any way. You can't do any kind of numbers, any kind of measurements, anything like that. So he says it's a pseudo-hypothesis. It's not because the issue is too deep for science, as he says, but that such statements make no assertions at all. They're not scientific at all. So this brings up kind of a lot of bigger issues. So I wrote an essay on this in my class, and one of the issues is, back in Aristotle's day, before Christ, nobody ever thought that anybody would be able to go on the moon, you know? And so how do you know it's really testable in theory? How do you know what kind of technology we're going to have in the future to be able to test certain things like that? Not only that, but you know, he uses that quote, "Nothing is too deep for science." But we have to wonder, maybe there are some things, you know. For example, you can't put human love under a microscope. You can't measure that, you know. So he talks about this issue of people talk about where, you know, how useful is non-scientific things. So there were certain groups of people around this time that said, if it's not scientific, it's not useful at all. It's all meaningless, doesn't have any importance to us. He kind of takes a middle ground. He says, you know, he gives this example of this one scientist who, he had this dream in the middle of the night, and he came up with this idea for some experiment. And he did it, and he discovered something new. And so Carl Hempel in this book says non-scientific things can be useful after all. But yeah, of course, you know, the questions come up, how do you find the meaning of life and things like that? Is there really issues that are too deep for science? Okay. So I would say there are a lot of things that science can't explain to us. Now, the next author that we read in this book, who was kind of the cornerstone of everything, was this man named Thomas Kuhn. So Thomas Kuhn wrote this book in 1962, just a few years before the other book from Carl Hempel called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And this was a really earth-shattering book for a lot of people when it came to science, inside the scientific community and outside the scientific community. So he said his idea for the book came when Kuhn was a graduate student, and he was asked to do some kind of project on the history of science. And while he was doing that, he was looking at all these old, out-of-date theories and experiments from Aristotle and Newton, all these things. And he realized that science wasn't really, the development of science isn't exactly as simple as you might have thought. A lot of people view science as kind of like this brick house where suddenly we make another discovery and we add another brick and another brick, and we come closer and closer to knowing the truth and getting the real data. But in the first line of Kuhn's book, he says, history, if viewed as a repository for more than anecdote or chronology, could produce a decisive transformation in the image of science by which we are now possessed. Now, instead of this brick house, this accumulation of data over time, he says that the science of back in the day, back even before the BC, was just as scientific and just as much a product of humans as it is today. Now, remember, I was just talking about this guy named Carl Hempel, and he says that a theory such as the one about the mutual attraction between the planets is totally unscientific. Now, Kuhn disagrees with that. He says, quote, if these out-of-date beliefs are to be called myths, then myths can be produced by the same sorts of methods and held for the same sorts of reasons that now lead to scientific knowledge. So he raises all kinds of questions. Maybe science isn't as sure maybe as we thought it was. But he says back in the day, people were always looking at these past scientists like Galileo, and they were comparing Galileo with what he thought with what we now know today. Now, he says, instead of doing that, we need to look at someone like Galileo in terms of what they were related to with their contemporaries, the people of their own time and their own culture. According to Kuhn, the way that science works is that scientists begin with a shared sort of commitments, which he calls a paradigm. They do research together based on this particular paradigm. In the process of discovery, of doing research and experiments, certain anomalies always surface that don't make sense with the commitments. So say the commitment is some kind of theory that all the scientists they've bought into, they all believe it, and they see certain anomalies that don't make sense, but they can't stop for all the anomalies, so they keep going, they keep believing the same thing. Now, finally, at some point, the paradigm, the theory, the commitment they've been following doesn't make sense anymore with the data. Scientists then shift their commitments to a new set, resulting in what Kuhn calls scientific revolutions or paradigm shifts. Now, scientific revolutions can be great or small, he says. The greatest ones, obviously, are the ones done by Copernicus, Sir Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein. We've all heard of those types of people. And what happens after a scientific revolution is the cycle starts over. All of a sudden, we go into a period which is what most people think of as science and what Kuhn calls normal science. So that's when everyone's bought into the same paradigm, and they're all doing their research and their experiments until, of course, more anomalies show up and another scientific revolution begins. But in the meantime, Kuhn says, normal science involves a lot of mop-up work, trying to solve the problems that the paradigm sets before us. So throughout the book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Kuhn goes into a lot of detail, kind of explaining this process. So, for example, he says, despite popular belief, to be accepted as a paradigm, a theory must seem better than its competitors, but it need not, in fact, never does, explain all the facts with which it may be confronted. He also points out few people realize how much work scientists have to do with all this mop-up work during normal science to solve all the problems that are put forth, because there are just so many. He says the paradigm does nothing other than it sets the problem to be solved, and normal science goes about solving it. Now, one peculiar thing that he points out is that to desert the paradigm, what all the other scientists are believing, is to cease practicing the science it defines. So, for example, if I told you I was a physicist and I didn't believe in gravity, automatically you would tell me that I wasn't a real physicist. And that's just kind of the way that science works today, is that everyone is bought into these specific paradigms. Now, Kuhn says, there are occasionally desertions where people desert the field with different beliefs. And if these people are right, it can often lead to a scientific revolution. Now, another example, this is one of my favorites of the book, but he uses a metaphor for describing how scientific revolution works. It was a psychological experiment that was done by two men who they had people come in and they would show them a playing card really fast, and the people had to identify which playing card it was. However, they didn't know that a lot of the cards were fake. They weren't real cards that fit into a deck of playing cards. So they had maybe a red 6 of spades or a black 4 of hearts that don't actually exist. So Kuhn describes the experiment as follows. Each experiment run was constituted by the display of a single card to a single subject in a series of gradually increased exposures. So they would show it to you for only a second, and then it might be 5 seconds, and so on. For the normal cards, these identifications were usually correct. So usually people would be able to tell pretty quickly if it was a normal card. But, he says, the anomalous cards were almost always identified without apparent hesitation or puzzlement as normal. So people would see the black 4 of hearts, and they would automatically identify it, he says, either with a 4 of spades or hearts instead, not even realizing it. So he says, without any awareness of trouble, it was immediately fitted to one of the conceptual categories prepared by prior experience. So this experiment is so fascinating to me because it shows that how often our culture, our country, where we grew up, so many of these things form the way that we look at things. So we think that we're seeing the right card, but in fact, it's a black 4 of hearts. It's not even that at all. And so also Kuhn says, with a further increase of exposure to the anomalous cards, subjects then begin to hesitate and to display awareness of anomaly. A few subjects, however, were never able to make out the requisite adjustment of their categories. Even at 40 times the average exposure required to recognize normal cards for what they were, more than 10% of the anomalous cards were not correctly identified. And the subjects who then failed often experienced acute personal distress. So there are a lot of people who they might go their whole lives never realizing that they were looking at a fake card. And it's the same with this experiment. And how often people are distressed when they realize what they believed for so long was wrong. And so this is the way that that society often gives us lenses to look through. And sometimes we stick to those lenses so religiously. Now, in regards to science, Kuhn says, in science, as in the playing card experiment, novelty emerges only with difficulty, manifested by resistance against a background provided for by expectation. So scientists, they're in these paradigms. They expect certain results from the data. And it only happens, he says, when somebody is able to recognize that something has gone wrong, is when paradigms happen. Now also later on in the structures, Kuhn goes into a critique of science textbooks, the very types that you or I might have used in our classes. Now he says, learners of science often believe that scientific data is stable and easily obtainable. You look into a microscope, you get the data, and that's it. But, Kuhn says, there really is no such thing as research without counter instances. Every paradigm, every theory, every experiment, there are always counter instances that go against the theory. Now, in regard to the textbooks, you may think, he says, that the textbook is giving the best evidence for that particular paradigm, and the reasons why you too should believe it. On the contrary, he says, the applications given in texts are not there as evidence, but because learning them is part of learning the paradigm at the base of current practice. So the textbooks we're getting today are all part of the current physics paradigm or biology paradigm or etc. He says textbooks have to be written in the aftermath of each scientific revolution. And once rewritten, they inevitably disguise not only the role, but the very existence of the revolutions that produced them. So we've all heard the phrase, the winners write the history books. And it's nowhere true or else than in science. Kuhn says, the depreciation of historical fact is deeply, and probably functionally, ingrained in the ideology of the scientific profession, the same profession that places the highest of all values upon factual details of other sorts. Now, of course, Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, is highly controversial. A lot of people in the scientific community were led to accept it, but also a lot of them were very upset. And part of this is another thing that he goes into, is that the reasons that scientific revolutions happen, the reason that people shift paradigms, it's rational, but there's also an irrational element to them, which doesn't come from the data alone. For example, he compares a scientific revolution metaphorically to a political revolution. In a political revolution, there's two opposing camps that are bitterly opposed to each other, and they become polarized. Now, he says, when you have these two different political camps, political recourse fails. The two opposing camps then, he says, resort to mass persuasion and force to win the revolution. It's almost as if the two sides are speaking two different languages that just don't translate with each other. And it's almost like they're making a circular argument. They're defending their own paradigm in the language of that paradigm. Therefore, he says, scientific revolutions reach a point where they cannot be settled by logic and reason alone. Now, of course, this led a lot of people into uproar, saying that Kuhn wasn't concerned with the objective truth and the objective facts of a scientific revolution, and they accused him of relativism, saying that any truth goes, whatever the people believes is right. Now, in his defense, he points out that a scientific revolution is not just the reinterpretation of the same data in a different light. For the data that scientists collect, he says, is never unmistakably stable, and the data varies from scientist to scientist. The data, he points out, is not the given of experience, but rather the collected with difficulty. In fact, Kuhn says that after a scientific revolution, a scientist may even have to admit that the data themselves had changed. And using another metaphor just as controversial, he says the transfer of allegiance from one paradigm to paradigm is a conversion experience that cannot be forced. So yes, he really literally compares it with faith, almost that you're being converted from one faith to the other. He even goes as far as to say the converting scientist has to have faith that the new paradigm will succeed with the many large problems that confront it, knowing only that the old paradigm has failed with a few. A decision of that kind, he says, can only be made on faith, while acknowledging also that there must be a basis for the faith in the particular paradigm chosen. So as the book draws to a close, Kuhn concludes with saying that maybe perhaps we ought to stop thinking of science as the subject that goes towards one particular goal, towards one particular certain truth, but instead see it as advancing towards the things that we as humans have chosen and have desired to know. Now, a lot of you can probably see why The Structure of Scientific Revolutions is such a controversial book for all of these reasons. But it became pretty popular, and the New York Times Book Review said, after Kuhn, we can no longer ignore the fact that however powerful science is, it is as flawed as the scientists who do it. And Kuhn, writing a postlude several years later, he said that he was kind of surprised that a lot of people from other fields outside of scientists approved of his book because they thought the concept of the paradigm shift applied to their subject as well, which it does, he admits. And they say that their way of following truth is comparable with that of how science finds truth. Now, Kuhn says that he's surprised by this, and he didn't really mean to degrade science in any way, but he just thought that he saw a lot of things that were going unrecognized, certain quirks in the way that science works that nobody else was talking about. He said it's natural that scientists focus on one paradigm alone because they're able to get a lot more done and a lot more discovery with that way. However, I think looking at this book from our perspective, that it gives an important case for the need of both faith and reason. Many people today insist that science and religion comes to objectively facts and data, whereas religion is just abstract ideas that can't be proven. However, Kuhn's book shows that maybe it's not as simple as we thought. Maybe there isn't that big of a difference. Maybe science can't solve all of our problems, at least all the ones that we thought it could. And that we too, like the scientists switching from paradigm to paradigm, also have to make a leap of faith. So that's all I have for this talk. And at this time, if anyone has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them. And I'm also going to repeat the question for the people on live stream if they want to hear it, but ask away. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, so he's asking who my professor was, UA. So I had Dr. Thomas Murray, who loves Thomas Kuhn, yeah. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 Sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, to be in the class, we actually read an article about COVID science and talking about it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Mm-hmm. Yes, you might. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just go back to, okay, so the question was, if people reject religion altogether and only want to go with science, then what would you say to them? And I would say that, I kind of mentioned it early in the talk, but Yeah, there are just a lot of things that science really can't explain to us. And against what the first guy said, Carl Hempel, I do feel like there are some issues that are really too deep for science. I think people, a lot of times we rely on it because it gives us, these plain numbers. We can put them in a system. We can find out the exact results. But just because we can't see the answer and the truths so clearly in religion and other things doesn't mean that the facts are less objective. And even in this talk, Kuhn talks about over and over how the data isn't as easy as you might think it is. There are different scientists with different data. The data changes over time. And so if you're making this leap of faith towards data, which isn't even that stable, then why not make a leap of faith towards religion? Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. Yes. Hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the question was, are we going through a paradigm shift in regards to the science of the human person? What would Kuhn say to that? So I think, yeah, you could definitely say that, because whether it's specifically a scientific paradigm shift or not, maybe that's up in the air, but obviously you look around today and there's a lot more confusion about what the human person is. I would say the old paradigm, going way back, was of course that the end of the human being is to love and serve God, as Baltimore Catechism maybe would say. But nowadays, it's like that new paradigm that people are committing themselves to is, I'm whatever I want to be, and I can do whatever I want to be. So yeah, absolutely. I can see that's sort of paradigm happening. I think Kuhn, in relation to his book, he's focused on the scientific side of it, and there's kind of a lot of psychology to that too. He talks about the human nature that goes into play in science, and he's starting to view things differently, where maybe science is more affected by human nature than we think. So I think in science, there was kind of a paradigm shift there to say, okay, maybe like the New York Times said, science is just as flawed as the scientists who do it. Yeah, so I see a lot of things going there. Yeah. Mhm. 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 Yeah, okay. So the question is, do I feel like I get instruction enough to address the issues going on with human nature today in society, especially the ones that science goes against? So I would say, yeah, actually, I do feel like I've gotten a lot of that. One of the philosophy classes I took was specifically the philosophy of the human person. So that was a really fascinating class to talk about, and just focus on the question, what is a human person and what's not? And realizing how difficult of a question that is, even in regard to what we used to think. And also, so I'll tell you, at CUA, they have a lot of guest speakers that are coming. And we had 2 speakers, at least last year, that came specifically to talk about gender issues. And so attending things like that, I think, really is important for me and for other seminarians to see that and get ideas, because we're all starting to realize how big of a pastoral need there is for these types of situations, for these, a lot of them are sexual issues, but behind them is issues of human nature, as you're getting at. So I feel like, yes, I have gotten a good amount of that. Always could be getting more, but yeah. So one of them was Matt Walsh. So he's been pretty big on the political side of things. And the other one was Abigail Favale. She's really interesting. So she is a Catholic convert. She bought into kind of a lot of the stuff of what our generation is saying today about gender and issues like that. Got some kind of like degree in feminist studies or something, and had this crazy conversion to Catholicism. Wrote a book on it. It's called "What Is Gender" or something like that, or "The Genesis of Gender" by Abigail Favale. So I have a copy of it. I haven't started reading it yet, but I heard her talk. So she's definitely somebody that anybody could look up. Mm-hmm. Nadeau. Favale. Sorry. Yes, sir. So yeah. So the question is, will science be able to replicate things like human emotions? So I would say, I've thought about this a lot, right? Because we have a lot of questions with, this issue, whether or not we're going to be able to create human beings, solely out of a laboratory. All these types of questions are like that. I think personally, this is just my personal take, but if you look at the Bible and the story of the Tower of Babel, right? Man has this idea that he's going to build this tower and reach heaven, which is ultimately that he's going to become like God. And God stops him before he can do it. So my theory is, obviously I believe that, this world was created by God, and this God is still the leader over all of it. So I believe that there are certain things that we won't be able to do through science. That's just my personal opinion. I could be wrong. Maybe they will replicate emotions, sometime in a laboratory. And whenever that happens, that, forces us to kind of change or alter our perspective, right? I'd say even if they were able to, it doesn't beat the real thing. A robot. Sometimes we do have really great discoveries, but at the same time, like for example, we have Chat GPT going on right now, and it can fully produce human essays and human arts of that sort. But I think at the end of the day, nothing is going to be greater than the art and the writing produced by the human person who's created by God. Yes. Okay. Okay, so the question is, how is evolution being taught kind of in the seminary? What are we to believe about it in regards to the faith? So I haven't actually, I would say in my classes, I haven't really talked about evolution, hardly at all. It's talked a lot amongst the seminarians, I'll tell you that. I remember a couple of guys getting into a pretty big debate about that. My understanding is that, it's not something that we have to believe one way or the other. We can believe in evolution or we cannot believe. I knew a seminarian who's very much would argue and had good reasons and good arguments for the fact that we shouldn't believe in evolution. Should not, yeah. So, and I listened to his arguments, and I was like, okay, maybe, he did know what he's talking about and everything, so. Yeah, so I mean, I kind of see it both ways. I haven't received any instruction specifically from the seminary or my professors in my classes or anything. I don't know. Possibly. I mean, I'm only in philosophy. I wonder in theology maybe if that would be touched upon. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No problem. Yeah. Yes. So the question is, do you think that science is able to disprove God? So, yeah, so it's a loaded question. My first instinct to say is that Thomas Aquinas says you can't demonstrate something that doesn't exist. So if God, I don't know, you could never demonstrate in a scientific experiment that God doesn't exist, is the way that I see it. And, there's really no conceivable way, I think, to come up with the data or the experiment to prove that that's wrong, I would say. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, either way that you look at it, what we're trying to explain is how something came from nothing. So even if you're going by science, you're trying to come up with a theory to explain how something can come out with nothing, which is really impossible. So it takes a lot of mental gymnastics there. Right, right. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the question is, did the class touch upon beauty and what science has to say about it? So overall, not really. You know, a lot of it was just kind of about what science is, what it's useful for, and what it's not. And I think a lot of the people that we talked about in the class, the scientists, were the type that are very materialistic and would probably reduce it to things like hormones and things like that, just like what our chemicals in our bodies are attracted to. And yeah, and unfortunately that's the perspective a lot of scientists are taking today. But one of the things that we got into this class is how turning from science we have today to back to actually the idea that Aristotle had, which is looking at things in their natures. And there was a modern scientist today that we read named Nancy Cartwright, and she said, returning to Aristotelian natures, right? And so the nature of something, it can be beautiful. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 We certainly talked about beauty a lot in other classes, philosophically, for sure. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any more questions? Any questions about seminary in general? Yeah, John. No, we should. Yeah, I know in the class we didn't talk about John Paul II's writings at all, unfortunately. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Nice. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, anybody else? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah, definitely. All right. Well, thank you guys.